Well, hello again. Welcome to what is to be the last of our broadcasts for this year, just around Christmas time. Lovely time of the year, and we welcome you to listen for the next little while to our church broadcast. And we're going to try and wrap up the year with thinking about how to make sense out of life. That's a complicated subject. We want to turn first to the scriptures and see what the Bible has to say about our lives, our backgrounds, and our future. And then we'll consider these things together and try and provide some hints as to ways that we can look at our lives and make sure that we're going in the right direction. So join with me now as we go through this study together. Psalm 139, we're going to read the whole thing. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thought from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down. You're intimately acquainted with all my ways. Even before there's a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all. You have enclosed me behind and before and laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high. I cannot attain to it. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I take the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will overwhelm me, and the light around me will be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is as bright as the day, darkness and light are alike to you. For you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame wasn't hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unformed substance. In your book were all written, and the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was not one of them. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would outnumber the sand. When I awake, I'm still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, men of bloodshed, for they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred. They've become my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. And see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. We'll come back and think about the psalmist's views on this subject. Obviously, he was facing complexity in his life, and he just surrenders it all to God and says, God, you know everything about me. All the things that are unknown to me are all part of your plan, and that's the end of the matter. And he develops the thought as he goes through the psalm, but we'll come back to that. I was trying to think of an illustration about the complexities of our life and how we might sort of come at this matter. And I thought, well, you know, our life is a bit like a library. And I thought, well, we're going to have a librarian in the audience today, so this will at least catch the interest of one person. And I've got a library at the other end of this room. And I was thinking, now, how do you order the books on a library shelf? Well, if it's my library, I'll do it the way I like. Well, what makes sense to ordering the complexities of the books on a library shelf? The important thing for me is that I'll know where to find what I'm looking for when I go to my library bookshelf. I think life is a little bit like this. It can be what seems to be a disordered list of random events, or it can seem to be a purposeful arrangement of things with a plan in view. And I want to point towards the latter and discount the former of those possibilities. If I want to get something from this exercise of having a library and having known books and having some idea what's in them, I've got to put them in some sort of order that makes sense to me. What are the things then that you and I, the tools that we use to say, that makes sense and that doesn't? If we're going to make sense of our lives, like we want to make sense out of the selection and the ordering of books in a library, then what makes sense? What are 5 rules that you might use to say, oh yes, that helps me make sense of things? Now here's one of them. Let me see if I can enlist the help of, is Summer there? Summer, can you come to me just for one moment, please? Thank you very much. And Summer's just going to come walking down to me from the library end, right the way down here. And I think because that is very, very good, I will shake your hand. Thank you very much. And for coming, that is for you. Thank you so much. I see you. Ruben, are you there, Ruben? Would you mind coming down here? Well done. Yes, okay. Right. Ruben, you shake my hand. Oh, well done, Ruben. Thank you. That's for you. Noah, would you like to come down here? Oh, thank you very much. That's very good. You're all doing really, really well. He's very good. You shake my hand. Oh, that's for you. Thank you very much. Jacob, what's going to happen next? Oh, Jacob's coming down here now. Isn't that a surprise? That's okay. Don't no, that's okay. You can stay there. You're all expecting for Jacob to come down here and get a loony, right? It's kind of predictable. It makes sense to your mind that what's happened in the past under identical circumstances will happen again in the future. And don't worry, Jacob, it's for you. One of the tests of common sense, and for us to apply in this matter, whether it's a library selection or our lives as a whole, is it predictable? Is the outcome predictable? Does it match with what's happened before? Let's leave that one just for a moment and think of another one. If we were to consider for a minute the other side of it, when somebody says, this is what I conclude on a matter, and you have to make sure that that makes sense, you're going to be looking for contradictions. And you're going to be saying to yourself, no, it can't do because it contradicts this that I already know. So consistency in terms of repetition and the ability to repeat a test and get the same result is rule number one. And the second one is non-contradiction. So it can't be this and that. It's got to be one or the other. And you're going to make that common sense test as you evaluate what's happening in your life. And try and say, it could be caused by this, it could be caused by that, it could be the purpose is this, or it could be that. And you're going to avoid contradictions. So it's a bit of a roll-on from the first one, but I think you get me. The third one. Sometimes when we have to analyze a situation, we haven't got an identical incident in the past. This has never happened to me before. Oh dear, if it's never happened before, then I don't know what's going to happen this time. Oh, but something similar has happened to somebody else. And I compare somebody else's experience with what I'm going through, and I say, yes, it makes sense because in the grand scheme of things, this makes sense. It compares well with other examples. They're not identical. It doesn't have to be identical. But the parameters are sufficiently similar to get me to say, yes, there's a comparability, and it's a logical comparability between this that's happened and that's happened. So we're looking for repeatability, we're looking for non-contradiction, we're looking for comparable examples when we're getting out of our own league into somebody else's experience to lead us in terms of what's going to make sense in the situation we're in. And the fourth one, at least on my list, God has endowed us with great capability between our ears. Some people say that you only use probably 10% of your brain power. I don't know how they measure that actually. But anyway, you know, I think most of us would admit that we sometimes make some foolish mistakes because we don't use our own inherent capability to work things out. But you're going to use this test whenever it's happening, even if you don't know about a comparable example, even if you're not worried about this non-contradiction and repeatability, you're going to say, does the logic that I'm being told make sense to me? How do you make this assessment that it makes sense? It's got to be logical. If it's totally illogical, you're going to dismiss it. You're going to say, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, sorry. It's no use telling me that this has happened in my life Because let's say, for instance, I got to the store and I hadn't got any money to pay for the goods that I wanted to buy. And somebody says, well, you know, the reason for that is because you're wearing a green shirt. You know, something's going to say to you, you're going to say, that's not logical. Now, if they say it's, you know, because you haven't got any money anyway, then that might start making some logical sense to you. That's probably what the problem is. Or something nearer. It's got to make some logical sense. You've got to be able to add things sequentially and say this plus this plus this does equal this. It all makes sense. So sometimes we try to explain the physical events that we see around us, and we can examine the physical things that are happening, and that can get complicated enough. And the psalmist was thinking about the world at large and all of the facts about, you know, where people came from and what happens to them in their lives. And the physical circumstances that surround us are hard enough to tackle. But then the psalmist says, but you understand my thoughts from afar off. So beyond the things that are material are the things that are immaterial. They're not immaterial in terms of inconsequential, they're non-material. They're of the mind and of the spirit and of the soul. And now we're into a complicated set of situations that affect us all, because that's our makeup, but it's not something that we can just measure one physical circumstance against another. I bump my toe and it hurts me. It's not like that. And yet it's just as true that if you say something adverse about me in my hearing, it hurts me. It's just as real. We're moving away from the physical into the things that really matter. And it's so good that the psalmist has given us a clue about how to make sense of our lives outside of the purely physical when he says, you understand my thoughts from afar. So even though God is close by, at the same time, the psalmist is saying, God is in heaven. But it's not that he's so far away that he's unconcerned about each of us. God is the one that formed me. He knew what my days were going to contain, and he understands the way I'm dealing with my life. Right now, this moment, he understands my thoughts from far away. Oh, he says, you've searched me. You've known me. You understand my thoughts from far away. And even before I say a word, you know what I'm going to say already. He's a God who was there before I was. He's a God who's going to be there after I cease to have a life here on earth. He's eternal, and he knows me intimately, and he even understands my thoughts, not just the things that are part of my life, making sense out of my life, even in the way that I think about them. So using these 5 kind of criteria, using these things, we can come back and into the context of the psalmist and into the context of the Bible. And we might say to ourselves, okay, does my life make sense? Am I doing the things in my life that I have done before and expect different results? We're all guilty of it. We make a mistake and we don't like the consequences, and then later on we're tempted to make exactly the same mistake again, but we think it's going to work out better this time. But common sense will tell you, no, some adverse things come into our life because we've broken rule number 1. We've ignored the fact that things should be tested by repetition. And I can learn about what's happening in my life from looking back at the way my life has proceeded to this point and see if there are any things that lead to the same conclusions. That would make sense of it. Leads into that second one about non-contradiction, doesn't it? You can see the application of that without me going into it too greatly. You can see that it's got to make logical sense. You can see all of these. One of the things that I didn't mention was that surely to make sense out of life, it should be simple enough. You know, it should be understandable. It should be simple enough and not overcomplicated. So we can use these rules, and you can apply them, as I've just mentioned to you, looking at the psalm, applying it to him, and then looking at yourself and applying it to what's going on in your life. Seeing if you can trace causes and effects, in terms of the continuity, the things that happen repeatedly, seeing if you can see where there's been a contradiction that shouldn't have been there, seeing if there's been any illogical action on your part or mine or somebody else's that have led to the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Checking out each of these things, and then finally concluding, now did we keep it simple enough? Do you remember the old KISS principle? Keep it simple, stupid. Well, you know, I'm guilty of that sometimes, and I make my life a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. When we've done that, and that's for personal exercise, you might, as a second application of that, ask yourself, well, how good am I at applying that rule when I'm dealing with other people? Let's start off with the simple one. If I've got to tell somebody else about Jesus, do they go away looking, or have they grasped it because I've made it simple enough for them to understand? Can you remember Acts chapter 16? It's around about verse 30 where you break into that chapter. One of God's messengers here on earth, Paul, the Apostle Paul, he's in jail. They spend the night in jail. All sorts of things have happened. The jailer now thinks that the prisoners have got away and that he's going to lose his life. And he yells out to Paul, a prisoner in the jail, and says, "What must I do to be saved?" And so if you carry on into verse 31, he says, well, first you must read and memorize the Pentateuch. And then you must understand that the 7 days of creation are literal days of creation. Oh, and by the way, when you get to the historical books, you've got to put them in the right sequence. No, I don't think he did that. He simply said to the man, believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and you will be saved. If we are going to tell somebody else how to become a Christian, we cannot leave any part of that out. They need to know who Jesus Christ is and that he is Lord, and that they need to believe it, not just with their head, but with their heart. But we don't need to overcomplicate it when we're introducing the subject. Are we able to make sense of other people's lives when they're going through circumstances and these complicated lives that we live, so that they can see that there's been a pattern that has been developing in their life, and the results that they're seeing now are a consequence of the pattern that's demonstrable from the things that have happened before? Do we have to take it one stage further than that and say, you know, this is contradictory to this. You have been living your life as though God didn't exist. And yet all around you, for the following reasons, bunk, 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 it's obvious that there is a God. You have been believing things that are contradictory and place before them facts for their belief. Do we do that? So do we keep it simple? Do we make sure that they're appreciating that life has served up some lessons? Do we show them where the contradictions may lie? All of us believe. We all have faith. It's not that some people have faith and some people don't. We just place that faith in different things. Christians place their faith in Christ. But if you're dealing with a person who's not a Christian yet, then they have faith and they are placing it in an alternative. And the alternative is contradictory to what you need to tell them. Do we do that with clarity? Are we able to defend what we believe in a logical way? Now I want to read some Bible verses with you, and you'll see that each of them touches on these criterion that we've been using, and helps in the Bible context to provide meaning to what we've been saying. So let me read the first one with you. And it's going, well, I've already quoted Acts chapter 16, verses 30 and 31 about the Philippian jailer. So let's go to Philippians. That Philippian jailer became a Christian. And you can't be a Christian satisfactorily just by yourself. You have to be with other Christians. So very, very soon, he found himself among other Christians in a church. And that church was, guess where? In Philippi, where he lived. And Paul, later on, wrote a letter to this church. And I wonder if the jailer was one of the people that received the letter. Anyway, we'll look at Philippians chapter 1. Philippians chapter 1. And we're only going to read one verse. I invite you to read more. But verse 27 says this. Only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or remain absent, I'll hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. Can you see how that's confirming the need for your life and your words to be consistent? Only let your manner of life, that the manner of life, what you say has got to be reinforced by the way you live. Otherwise there's a contradiction. You're looking for contradictions in other people's lives to explain what makes sense in their setting. They're looking at you and saying, does what he's saying make sense when I see him do these things? So people that are Christians that are in churches of God, they take on a new relationship. They're all children of God and they're related to each other. And so they call themselves brothers and sisters. That's not the natural family, but that's the spiritual family that they form a part of. And in a church setting, it's emphasized. So verse 15 of James chapter 2 starts out, if a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. If I'm to make sense out of my life, and if I'm to make sense out of your life, or to help you make sense out of your life, then what I do and what I say have got to hang together. They've got to be consistent. In chapter 3 of 1 Peter and verse 13, we read these words. Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. Don't fear their intimidation. Don't be troubled. But you sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you're slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. For it's better, if God will, that you suffer for doing what is right, rather than for doing what is wrong. The psalmist had got it right. He was looking at his life and realizing his own inadequacies, making sense of his life by reference to what God saw in him and God's purpose in his life. Sometimes that purpose confuses us. Now at this point I want to hold this little thing up. I don't know if on the video we'll be able to focus on that. Can you all clearly see that? Oh, you can't clearly see it.
No.
Okay, well maybe if I turn it around. Now, if you were close to me, you'd probably be able to read that Bible text and make more out of it. What I'm trying to illustrate here is the weaving, or the embroidery in this case. On the back of it, it doesn't make sense, while on the front, all the while the person doing the embroidery or the weaving is working away. It's producing a pattern and an output that makes complete sense. Let me read you this little poem. It's an old poem. You've probably heard it before. My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I cannot choose the colours, he weaveth steadily. Ofttimes he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper, and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent, and the shuttles cease to fly, will God unroll the canvas and reveal the reason why. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned. He knows, he loves, he cares, nothing this truth can dim. He gives the very best to those who leave the choice to him. Making sense of our life. What's the first thing I've got to come to terms with if I'm to make sense out of my life? It's this issue of control. Who's in control? You've got three options. You're in control. It's your life. You're in control of it. Second option, you're part of a random sequence of undetermined events. Nobody's in control. And the third option that I'd like to put before you is where the psalmist was coming from. God is in control. He's like the weaver who's working away behind the scenes. And each time we make a mistake, he's got a corresponding action to it. Not only a corrective so that we won't repeat the mistake, but also something that will benefit us from it, from our learning. He's also working with the things that other people do wrong that affect us. It's not our fault, but he allows them to come into our life like the dark threads that are necessary in the fabric to highlight the beautiful threads that he's weaving in there too. That's the hardest part for us to come to terms with. And if we don't acknowledge that God is in control, then we're just left with the other two options. Is it me and I've got to blame myself for everything adverse that happens? I hope you don't get into that depressing outcome. Or is it just a random series of events? Well, it's just the way it happens, just the way it happens. I've got no responsibility, therefore, for the outcome. The scripture seems to point to God having a close concern about every aspect of our lives. Whatever troubles you, troubles and concerns him. And even in the smallest things of life, we can take it to God and say, this is what's worrying me today. I can't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me. And then we can apply our God-given abilities to help us make sense out of it using these 5 rules if you want to use those. But getting into the Bible as God's message to us, relevant to our lives today, and see what he says in terms of guidelines that we are to apply in our life. Peter says, some tough things are going to happen to you. Just make sure you don't deserve them. That's the essence of what he's saying. You know, it's not very good to suffer, but it's a whole lot better to suffer for doing the right thing than to suffer for doing the wrong thing. God will allow both. God wants you to benefit from the blessing of doing the things that are right in accordance to his will for your life. Sometimes that's going to put you into conflict with other people who are not at all concerned about his will in their lives. And we will have to suffer under such circumstances. But if we stay true to God, then the one who understands the thoughts afar off is going to be able to enter into our life and lead us in the right way. You go all the way through that psalm. It starts off, oh God, you have searched me. He knows what God has already done. And then he tells God all about his awareness of what God has done before he was born and then in his life. And then the opposition that comes into his life. And, well, I don't like this stuff any more than you do, God. And then he comes back to where he started. Psalm 139, about verse 24. Search me, O God. And know that I'm right? No, search me, O God, and know my heart. If there's any wicked way in me, it says one of the versions, any grievous way, anything that's causing unnecessary sorrow, point it out to me so that I can do my part to put it right. You lead me in a way that leads to everlasting life. So I just put the psalm before you this morning. You'll make sense of it, I hope, and perhaps it'll help us on in our progress in the study of this complicated subject of life and how it does or does not make sense to us on any particular day. And maybe you'll get some benefit from that study. So God bless.